Okay, and we are ready with the live stream. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session, Black Performance and Material Culture. My name is Aaliyah Proctor. I'm an assistant professor of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. Oh, and I'm standing in front of our lovely panel. I'm excited to be chairing the session. Um, so here is our main current speech. We acknowledge that Tacoma lies on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup tribe. The Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 forcibly removed Native peoples to clear way for colonial settlement, but the Puyallup people have cared for and lived on these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. The Society for American Music sends gratitude to the Puyallup tribe, upon whose ancestral lands we convene for this conference. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step toward true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the indigenous peoples of this land and beyond. So as I just said, this session will be live streamed, and so please be aware when asking questions that you may or may not be on camera, which is located over to the side of the room. On that note, we ask that you please refrain from videos, photos, or your own live streaming of materials presented during this session. We would also like to remind you of SAM's Code of Ethics, which commits us to respect the diversity of opinions as expressed by its membership, and to maintain a professional level of courtesy, respect, and objectivity in all society activities. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Elaine Fitzgibbon. Elaine Fitzgibbon is a historical musicologist with a focus on the intersections of experimental
that we see personified in artistic tradition that recognizes its deep roots in the African continent. Such hypocrisies of a conservative art religion are also pilloried in Colescott's 97 Ode to Joy, at which Colescott was at work in the lead-up to the Biennale. And in Ode to Joy, we might read a crystallization of the themes put forth in Blues for the Muse and the recent paintings Biennale exhibition more broadly. Given the title of the painting, Beethoven's iconic Ode is immediately recognizable. In their white and black, the 4 bars of musical notation create a stark contrast with the garish waves of varying colors that swirl throughout the canvas. These notes do not, however, the trailing white line emanating from the female figure's mouth makes clear that they are, in fact, sung. Sharing center stage with the notation is this fleshy and scantily clad white woman who whistles Beethoven's tune while simultaneously bringing a piece of pepperoni pizza to her masked mouth. But this is no simple mask. The woman, her body a fantastical projection of male fancy, with her exaggerated hourglass figure and breasts threatening to escape her bikini, is indeed in blackface. Her hand is raised to her face as if she were holding up a mask, and all that lies above is a disturbing product of a different kind of fancy. Her face is an uncannily deep black, and the unevenly shaped white circles of her eyes and nostrils create a flat, inhuman impression. Meanwhile, her image is fractured on the left-hand side, as if she's being refracted through a broken mirror. She herself is in the process of gaining form, as she swirls from the golden genie's lamp that rests upon a table in the bottom center of the painting, flanked by the winking, pouting faces of 2 skeleton twin girls with cotton candy-like heads, mirror images of each other and likewise a model, perhaps those story daughters of Elysium. Below it all lies an endless mound of hamburgers, their golden coin-like shape doubling the gold overflowing from the pot in the precise center of the painting, and the larger sunlight coin just below. Thus, the surreal world of modern capitalism, of desire, death, fetishization, and greed takes center stage, accompanied by the Beethovenian tones of brotherly love. As in the Blues for the Muse, thus the formal structure of the painting guides the viewer's eye in a swirling path, the yellows, greens, and deep reds evocative of the Pan-African flag, the swaths of hazy color on the right side of the painting reminiscent of de Kooning in all his violent carnal fleshiness. The genie's bottle releases into this crowded atmosphere objects in double, parallel figures and mounds of greasy nourishment mirroring each other on both right and left. The cracked mirror that breaks up the masked woman's face points to the counterfeit nature, as Ralph Ellison once termed blackface performance, of these delectable objects of consumption, and the double consciousness that the fracturing of identity produces in those forced to live in a society that papers over its history with proclamations of equality while continuing to perform the same song and dance of racial terror. The unity of brotherhood is intoned by this cartoonishly buxom, counterfeiting fantasy of male desire, the wisp of notation slipping from her lips, finding its mirror image in the smoke that trails from the bottle's spout. Smoke and mirrors, anthems and odes that spiral around each other with the hope of gold at the end of the rainbow. Less than a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 4 years following the creation of the European Union, Colescott's Ode to Joy is a complex commentary on the economic and social structures that support Western democracy. Mobilizing the symbolic value of the Union's recently chosen anthem, filled with its proclamations of universal brotherhood, of uniting that which social conventions have segregated and embracing millions, Colescott places the notation in the mouth of an exoticized face of promise, thus setting in dialectical tent the heights of utopian strivings with the base objects of unrepressed capitalist desire. What do we gain then when we follow Colescott's recommendation to READ these paintings and HEAR their songs? We experience music at the intersection of its utopian potential and the legacies of its instrumentalization as a tool of oppression. In Colescott's paintings, we see the singing of the glimmers of futures imagined otherwise. Invariably, however, when music is referenced in Colescott, in scholarship on Colescott, the author speaks of jazz, using this otherwise unspecified musical genre to claim improvisation as a central quality of Colescott's work. Yet, regardless of what disparate musical genres Colescott might choose to evoke from his representational toolbox, improvisational or otherwise, what is clear from the brief glance at these paintings is the formal control of their composition, a control that allows Colescott to harness the extraordinary exuberance and eternal contradictions of music as a social art. Indeed, the significant presence of music and scenes of musicking in Colescott's work point to the artist's recognition of the role that music, sound, and the theater of music performance play in the strange cultural landscape of 20th century America. Through narrative, a temporality is unleashed in the paintings. Like the temporal nature of music, the paintings require the viewer to tarry a while, tracing the narrative from one end of the painting to the other and back again. In Colescott's hands, this painterly music is at turns plaintive, anxiety-inducing, or divulging of repressed desire, and in every case, entwined in negotiations of race, power, and identity. It is everywhere, and all of us are implicated, the artist included, as we navigate the ludicrous temptations and carnivalesque realities of contemporary American life. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. We have a few minutes for questions. Are there any? And we have a microphone runner. Yes, and a microphone assistant.
Thank you for this talk. I was just wondering, in all of your very beautiful readings of these paintings, what the people at the Venice Biennale thought in the 1990s. And also, yeah, no, I'll just leave it there. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Annie. Great question. There were really mixed reviews. And that's actually really been true of his reception history basically until the 2010s, when he's been embraced more positively and actually shown really not for the first time, but the first time widely throughout the country and specifically in New York. The reviews, yeah, there were some people many people who were really upset by the work, who found it to be offensive, just as if it shouldn't exist. And I think the shock of the work, and Colescott spoke in many different interviews, sort of referred to his work as having a 1-2 punch. You encounter this phrase in like all the writing about him. He liked to repeat it a lot, I think. That the first punch is the shock of seeing it, and the second is, again, in this sort of temporal quality of the paintings that comes from the narrative, structure, the experience of reflecting on it for years to come, basically. And I think that first shock of being confronted with this visual imagery and the representation of minstrel characters and of blackface, that was something that people found impossible at the time, which I think speaks to, 90s era conversations around race and representation. But yeah, it's really only recently that he's received a more nuanced reception.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one more quick question. All right. Our second panelist is Jennifer Messelink. Jennifer Messelink is a lecturer at the University of Victoria's School of Music. She recently completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in African American Studies at Yale University. In 2023, she earned a PhD in musicology from McGill University. Her current book project, titled Quiet Resonance, Race, Gender, and Mood Music in Mid-Century America, documents entanglements of race, gender, and sound technologies in the emergence of post-war instrumental mood and background music. Her work has been published in the Journal of Popular Music Studies, Women in Music, a Journal of Gender and Culture, and the Journal of Jazz Studies. Her paper, Piano Moods, which she is presenting today, recently won the AMS Jazz and Improvisation Study Group Research Paper in Jazz and Improvised Music Award. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jennifer Messelink.
Thank you so much. I'd like to dedicate this talk today to a dear friend and mentor, Jonathan Stern, who passed away on Friday after a long battle with cancer, and he will be greatly missed. When Columbia Records launched the LP in 1948, Life magazine captured the moment. The photo essay featured Columbia engineer Peter Goldmark comparing the spatial qualities of the new LP to the old shellac 78. Media historian Lisa Gilman suggests that new forms of media become meaningful in the context of older media. Just as the LP could easily be imagined in domestic spaces because of the pre-existing design of the 78 record, consumers are already familiar with the sizes of 10-inch and 12-inch LPs because they carried over from the earlier era of the 78. Dimensions and durations may seem like neutral design elements, but as media historian and theorist Jonathan Stern emphasizes, the stories we tell about formats matter. These sizes were not unique to the LP. They were decided in the early days of sound recording when a system for the containment of Black music emerged in which recording formats were tied to racial identity. The 12-inch discs became the de facto luxury format for Victor's classical music Red Label records, and the 10-inch race record, while a source of pride for many African Americans, soon became the bread and butter of most recording companies. Prior to the LP era, essentialist notions of Black music as dance or novelty and prohibitive Jim Crow conditions restricted most Black artists from recording works that did not adhere to the strict 3-minute 10-inch record format. When Columbia began building up their LP catalogs, the 10 and 12-inch formats of the 78 were retained, so the LP could fit with the design of the existing playback turntables. But the format's generic classifications were also carried over. Columbia's first 200 LPs were made up of 100 10-inch popular records and 100 12-inch classical records. The new microgroove design was celebrated as having fixed the problem of interruption for listeners of long classical music works. No need to turn over the record in the middle of a movement. But for popular music, the longer listening time of the LP created a new problem. Because popular music was measured in short 3-minute song hits, there was no system in place to market continuous popular music on LP, as one record executive mused, who on earth once strung together some arbitrary choice of 6 or 8 dances or ballads on one record? You could not reasonably expect 6 or 8 hits every time. To address this problem, Columbia formed the Popular Album Department headed by George Avakian. One of Avakian's first productions was Piano Moods, a series of 22 10-inch LPs of mostly New York-based pianists who were all recorded in a similar style with similar artwork. Piano Moods offered a medley of standard popular songs designed to blend together through a technique Avakian called a continuous music device. Working closely with the recording engineers, Avakian devised the idea of maintaining a continuous flow of music by eliminating the spaces between the songs on the record. And I've chosen this image because you can see the record clearly and there are no spaces between the songs. And in fact, I had to buy some of these on eBay to really make sure and double check that there were no spaces between the songs, and indeed there are no spaces between the songs. Okay. To establish continuity, Avakian had most of the pianists prepare the songs in such a way that the key and tempo of the preceding tune seamlessly modulated into the next song. Avakian has stated that he not only drew from his experience producing jazz albums of the 1940s, such as Chicago jazz and hot jazz classics, but the innovative techniques of Black pianists, including Duke Ellington and Errol Garner, who are expanding the time limitations of the 3-minute song form. Piano Moods is thus at the intersection of two formats, the Shellac 78 and the LP. With the exception of Darren Mueller's recent At the Vanguard of Vinyl, which interrogates the early years of the LP as a dynamic object embedded with racial and gendered politics, the phonograph tends to be nested in histories of media and sound recording technologies. The emergence of the LP is generally treated as a rupture or a break with the past, and the periods before and after the LP are treated as separate and distinct. Jonathan Stern, however, suggests that instead of focusing on the differences between recording formats, we should consider the embedded ideas that cut across them. When the LP was released in 1948, the technology could now extend recording beyond the capacity of the 78, but there was still that question of how to market a continuous stream of popular music. Given that Avakian's ideas for packaging Piano Moods derived from earlier Black musical and recording practices, I propose that a paradigmatic shift was already underway prior to the adoption of the LP, wherein popular music was being rethought in spatially expansive ways by Black artists. The shift was then more fully realized through the technological affordances of the new LP format. In this paper, I argue that the innovative spatial practices of Black pianists are directly connected to the marketing and success of the LP as a concept, and are therefore essential in understanding the history of these recording formats. In the sections that follow, I look at two instances in the years leading up to Piano Moods where shifting perceptions of race and space cut across recording formats. The racialized critiques of Duke Ellington's extended works, in particular the recording of Reminiscing in Tempo, and the boogie-woogie craze around 1940 that led to a type of permission structure and allowance of Black music on 12-inch formats. And I borrow this term from politics, from Obama's political strategy, which viewed endorsements from respected figures or institutions as crucial to the acceptance of a Black president. I extend the theoretical framework of Black geographies to music formats to argue that the way Black musicians spatial expansions within and against the racialized limitations of recording durations informed Avakian's ideas for continuous music on Piano Moods. In his memoir, Duke Ellington recalls the difficulties he faced recording musical works that extended beyond the durations of the 3-minute 10-inch format. Reminiscing in Tempo, for example, was almost 13 minutes long, and after lengthy negotiations with Brunswick, it was released as 4 parts on 2 10-inch 78 records. While the work was celebrated in some circles, many issued scathing reviews, critiquing it as an utterly formless, false and born creation of worthless trash, formless and shallow, and a long, rambling monstrosity. Some proclaimed Ellington should not write beyond the limitations of the 3-minute 10-inch format, even accusing him of abandoning his race. Jazz critic Günter Schuller in 1992 attempted to account for the extreme reaction, suggesting that it was, quote, because of racial and social prejudices that jazz recordings were limited to the 10-inch format, end quote. But rather than focusing on the critiques of length and formlessness, I suggest that the framework of Black geographies offers insights into how the work elicits a Black spatial knowledge that is not necessarily compatible with the European classical concept of form. Catherine McKittrick argues that Black matters are spatial matters. Practices of domination, such as the segregation policies and indignities of Jim Crow, quote, naturalize both identity and place, repetitively spatializing where non-dominant groups naturally belong, end quote. In Ellington's case, European notions of formal compositional unity intersect with strict industry control of the durational space on formats to maintain the function of Black music as dance music or entertainment. In her study of enslaved women and the plantation South, historian Stephanie Camp addresses different mapping traditions between enslaved people and planters through the concept of rival geographies. Camp examines how the mapping of planters' farms was defined by fixed places for plantation residents, whereas a rival geography produced by enslaved people was an unsettled spatial formation characterized by motion, the movement of bodies, objects, and information within and around plantation space. I borrow from Camp's notion of rival geographies to suggest that Ellington's engagement with the form of reminiscing in tempo is based on a different spatial epistemology than that of his critics. It is a not-so-fixed form derived from a spatial awareness of memory, motion, and geography. In his memoir, Ellington describes the conditions under which he wrote Reminiscing in Tempo as he moved across the Jim Crow South, and in doing so, he sketches a map of memory, music, motion, and geographic location. In 1935, on one of these one-nighter tours of the South, after I lost my beautiful mother, I found the mental isolation to reflect on the past. It was all caught up in the rhythm and motion of the train dashing across the South, and it gave me something to say that I could never have found the words for. It was a detailed account of my aloneness after losing my mother. Dangling out there, somewhere in a wilderness of the unknown, were things and creatures that I neither saw nor heard were moving around. I was not sure where I was. Daisy Ellington Kennedy died at the age of 56 in May 1935, and I have pieced together details of Ellington's tour dates following her death that can in turn be mapped onto the piece. On July 6th, the Afro-American reported Ellington recently completed a tour of one-nighters through Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, and is headed for engagements in Oklahoma, Texas, and several states throughout the South. On July 20th, Billboard reported that Ellington is at present sweeping across Louisiana on one-day stops heading into Texas territory. Between July 6th and 20th, 1935, Ellington traveled into the South, and the tempo and motion of the train, quote, gave him something to say that he could not have found the words for. I mentioned earlier that Reminiscing in Tempo was released as 4 parts on 2 10-inch 78 records, and the critiques of the work focused on form and length. In parts 1 and 4, there is a clear AABA form. However, in the middle of the piece, the phrases vary in length from anywhere between 4 to 12 bars. There are several passages where the entire ensemble drops out, and Ellington is left alone at the piano, where he is, in his words, somewhere in a wilderness of the unknown. Ellington's piano solo moves in and out of tempo, and it seems as if each time he tries to resolve an idea or phrase, another thought comes in and extends the feeling. His aloneness does not end when the record has reached its time limit. The solo piano continues across the break and into the beginning of part 3. As more instruments are added, the themes become layered. For example, a lamentation motive that was initially introduced in the lowest voice has now moved to the highest voice and combined with the other voices into the sound of a dissonant train whistle. This train whistle eventually fades into the background, and the steady rhythm and motion of the train draws Ellington back, suggesting he has moved through his grief and resolved to rejoin the world. The sonic and formal features of his return to the world comprise the entire side of part 4 and follows a very conventional 32-bar AABA form with 8-bar phrasing. This analysis may be speculative, but as Satya Hartman reminds us, speculation activates a methodological approach to writing Black histories that are erased from the historical record. My speculations are based on Ellington's description of the piece, his recollections of his mother, his geographic location in the South, and the way he plays with musical form to make connections between geographies, music, emotion, and memory. I'm particularly interested in why Ellington chose to continue the piano solo through the break instead of beginning part 3 with a new idea. If we consider the recording format as a system of containment, could Ellington's continuation of the piano solo be considered a form of resistance to the enforced limitations of the 10-inch disc? Could Ellington's playing across the break be read as a refusal to adhere to the standards imposed by a recording industry that refused to see Black music as history, as memory, and as expansive? In a 1941 a Music and Rhythm article revisited Reminiscing in Tempo and suggested that the fourth section be eliminated and that Ellington should, quote, be allowed to wax a new recording on two sides of a 12-incher, end quote. The author argued that the piece was complete without the last AABA section because the first three sections contain the classical essentials of unity of structure and variety of theme. If we take seriously Ellington's descriptive map of the piece, the fourth section is crucial to the structure of the composition because it provides a contrast to his wandering solo piano and represents his affirmative return to the world. But the idea of cutting the last section to fit with the European notion of form is not my focus. Rather, it is the way the author's language of allowance reflects concurrent events that were taking place around 1941 that led to a type of industry-wide permission structure around the acceptance of Black musical recordings on 12-inch 78. And this was the rumblings of the boogie-woogie craze that would set the tone for piano moods. Throughout the 1930s, recordings of boogie-woogie piano were restricted to race records and live performances to rent parties and other spaces of Black cultural life. White audiences in New York were introduced to boogie-woogie by way of John Hammond's Carnegie Halls from spirituals to swing concerts, which generated a boogie-woogie craze. A flurry of recordings featuring Meade Lux Lewis, Albert Ammons, and Pete Johnson followed. These were among the first jazz popular albums wherein white industry figures such as George Avakian and John Hammond began to shape the historiography of jazz by repackaging Black music as a form of artful expression. I propose that these recordings also participated in shifting attitudes around Black music on 12-inch records. The first Blue Note recording was made by Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons following Alfred Lyon, when Alfred Lyon saw their performance at Carnegie Hall. And Tempo reported on the following development. A new company named Blue Note has crashed the collector's market with a couple of 12-inch platters at $150 each. The stuff is there and the boys have plenty of elbow room to put their rhythm on wax. They caught a little more inspiration on these records than last month's Vocalions. Maybe the size of the disc has something to do with it. This review suggests that the duration of a recording was an important factor in the acceptance of Black music as an expressive form. Instead of music for dancing, the longer length of the 12-inch recording provided some elbow room necessary for inspiration. In Richard Cook's History of Blue Note Records, he writes about this recording session, noting that instead of the 3-minute duration which the 10-inch customarily enforced, Alfred Lyon allowed both Ammons and Johnson to play longer solos, and the resulting masters had to be pressed as 12-inch discs, a rarity in jazz terms. This example mirrors the claims about Ellington being allowed to record Reminiscing in Tempo on 12-inch, pointing to a similar permission structure related to duration. But again, rather than focusing on the actions, power, and perspective of industry men, I want to highlight the Black spatial practices of the musicians as a crucial and underexamined aspect of this shift. Brent Hayes Edwards argues that there are several different ways that sound and print can speak in Black cultural productions. Albert Ammons once remarked that the left hand tells the real story of Boogie Woogie. Put another way, what did Boogie Woogie say? In 1939, Meade Lux Lewis was interviewed by Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress. The interview offers us a chance to listen to the interplay between the words and sound that Edwards cites as a fundamental imperative in Black music. In the following excerpt, Alan Lomax asks Lewis about his compositional process for Honky Tonk Train Blues. And I know that's small, and I hope you can hear this.
Naturally, my father's name was Pullman Porter, and we living there too, right by the railroad. Why, very plain, I always heard the train going along. He used to tell us a lot of times when a train would come by and the house would shudder and shake. Well, he said that's one of those big voices, that's what he called it. He thought it was exceptionally big. I said, well, man, that was an awful big train, man, and they all out and shake like this. The foundations would quake. I said, boy, you don't know, that's a fast train. I used to way that night sometimes when the train would go to whistle. I could just hear it through the planes, left, right. I just could see that thought into me. When the train would leave the station, I just figured it would go like this. And the engineer would give that signal. It would stop.
The interview continues.
Now that left hand going the same all the way through, what does that represent? Is that the wheel looking on the rail?
I represent the engine. I represent the wheel.
And how did you work out the different variations or the different choruses, you might call them? With the right hand. How did you get your idea? Did you do it all at one time, just keep on working at it, or maybe one week you think of a new one and add a new chorus the next week?
That's exactly. That's exactly. I mapped it out the best I possibly could. I figured it out by the train, stopping at various places, picking up passengers. Where did it stop at? I don't know exactly. I just could see it in my mind. I just mapped it out, this is vivid. I just pictured things that it would be like that, and just figured out the sentences I would say in different times and like this. Well, I figured he was just rolling along.
There's a visionary aspect that Lewis speaks of in describing his process. I mapped it out, just in a vision, he explains. Similar to the way that Ellington provided a map of reminiscing in tempo, Meade Lux Lewis creates a spatial imaginary in which the sound reflects the lives of the people who inhabit his world. James Gordon Williams argues that Black musicians are space creators by asserting their humanity in defiance of the social and geographical constraints of structural and institutional racism. For Black people during Jim Crow, Meade Lux Lewis maps the freedom of movement by documenting the steady movement of the train in the left hand and the agency of people as they move freely from place to place in the right hand. The left hand operates independently of the right hand, but together they weave a complex polyrhythmic tapestry of shared experiences and traditions that voice a boogie-woogie soundscape of New York in the pre-civil rights era. In this paper, I have argued that the musical practices of Black musicians should be included in the history of recording formats. I've drawn on the words and music of Duke Ellington and Meade Lux Lewis and extended the notion of Black geographies to music formats to listen for Black epistemologies and the struggle for racial justice that unsettle recording format as a system of containment. Through this framework, we hear how Black musicians reimagine spatial expansions within and against the racialized limitation of recording durations. The success of piano moods pulled the industry through the turbulent early years of switching over to the LP, and by 1954, thematic popular albums had replaced the single hit song as the primary system for measuring record sales. But Avakian did not come up with this idea completely on his own. He drew from the intellectual contributions of Black pianists whose archival memory work and visions of freedom were extending the possibilities of form and format in the years leading up to the LP. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much for this fascinating paper. We have quite a few minutes for questions, 9 minutes for questions. Yes.
That was very interesting. I always find, the whole recording industry and kind of some of the restrictions it does place on performers very interesting. Just as a contrast, around 1924, J.L. Errol Morton recorded some of his piano works. And one of them, Shreveport Stomps, was recorded about a 4.5 minute length. He was allowed some time to do variations and things on that roll. So it's just, and the fact that they did that is more compounded in the sense that someone had to go back through and edit Morton on the roll, because that's what they did with hand-played rolls, piano rolls. So it's just a matter of contrast. And in that instance, he was given kind of more of that elbow room that he wanted to be able to do that. That in all the ones that he's recorded as hand-played rolls, that was the only one where he was really allowed to do that. But it is at least an example. And somewhere some sweat went through to edit those performances to allow for that length.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't really know much about piano rolls, but do you know like the duration of piano rolls? Like how long could they last for?
Typically, they're like a 78, you know, you figure around 3 minutes or something like that. So that was the norm. So so he was kind of going out, he was going outside the norm, and he was kind of allowed to, because that was not, it was more expensive for the roll company to do, not only in editing, but also in production, because it had to be a longer roll.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, I just thought I'd point that out as another example.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this kind of, we can track these kind of limitations of recording durations sort of through all recording in the 20th century, where it's once we get to the LP, we get this way of kind of having more expanded time, and then CDs, and then streaming, and then digital, and everything kind of like allows for this like longer space. But it's more about, I think, the acceptance of the types of music as well, like by the public and by those in the music industry, rather than so much even the technology itself. But yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
Okay, I'd love to ask. Yes, this is, and I'm trying to formulate it in my head because it has the cylinders firing. I really, really love how you're pulling from people like Catherine McKittrick and extending Black geographies into music and material culture. I think that this work is very crucial. And I guess my question is more of an invitation to talk about how you see this work intersecting with gender or femininity, masculinity, because McKittrick's work is Black women and the cartographies of struggle. I was thinking of, you're framing the LP and recording technology in a sense as a cartography of struggle, and we don't really get into the gender dimensions here, but I imagine that you're thinking about it. So I would love to hear your thoughts briefly on how gender is factoring into your analysis.
Yeah, thank you. I've definitely been thinking a lot about it because obviously I have these musicians who are male, and trying to think about how to think about Black geographies in music, and not only music formats that I'm talking about here, but like a bigger project of musical spaces. And I'm thinking especially about, for gender, these ideas of like rent parties and spaces of, Black cultural activities. And because women, throughout the 20th century are very much, Black women are very much like in the background, but also doing all this really important work, like providing spaces for this music to happen. I'm thinking about radio as well as a space of kind of music and sound. So like this is definitely a bigger project that I haven't quite fleshed out yet, but it's like a chapter, and I am gonna, I'd like to talk with you more about maybe your ideas of how it could, I know, because I'm like open to it.
Yeah, I was thinking of Hazel Scott in terms of piano, and I didn't know if her music was coming into this, music without breaks in between it, or if she was a little bit after. Did you run into Hazel Scott's work?
Yes, absolutely. I've been thinking about, yes, her, and also, the spaces that she played in New York City as well. But yeah, I've definitely been thinking about her.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay. Well, thank you. Okay. We have a kind of competing microphone situation happening with our room, and it must be Venice 2 here. So we managed to turn the sound up, and I hope everyone's able to hear. I also hope that we are not causing issues for that, but it is the struggle of the ballrooms. So our final presenter is Kawela Chirwa. Okay, Kawela Chirwa is a PhD candidate in musicology at the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. He is an Albert C. Yates Fellow at the University of Cincinnati and received a Future of Music Faculty Fellowship from the Cleveland Institute of Music. His dissertation, titled Community Making Across the Black Diaspora, Building Networks and Narratives in Nigerian Urban Popular Music, works to examine the intersecting communities, sounds, and cultures that are currently represented in Nigeria's popular music industry. Furthermore, his research positions Lagos as a nexus of popular musicking in Nigeria, Africa, and the Black diaspora. Much of his dissertation is based on fieldwork conducted in 2024, funded by a Fulbright study/research grant. He also reflects on the Nigerian popular music industry, neocolonial systems within popular music, and the implications of ethnography in the recently published Diversity and Activism issue of Rising Voices in Ethnomusicology. The title of his paper today is Centers of Diaspora in the U.S. Midwest, Afro Nation Detroit, 2023 and 2024. So please give a warm welcome to Kawelo Chiwa.
Thank you so much. In most cases, theorizing centers and peripheries of diaspora would place a diasporic community's homeland at the center, with the various locations in which members of that diaspora reside as the peripheral spaces to that particular community. At risk of stating the obvious, the real or imagined, contemporary or historical, surviving or dismantled geographic location that connects a dispersed people tends to be the primary thread that identifies diaspora. Certainly, social practices, religions, and identity classifications have been argued as defining characteristics of diaspora, yet in discussion of geography and diaspora, this concept of a homeland remains a consistent factor. Despite this understanding of diasporic homelands, I'm compelled to consider the spaces beyond the homeland that build a resemblance or resonance of shared cultural understanding. In some instances, much like the foundations of diaspora studies, establishing homelands and spaces beyond a tangible homeland may be a mechanism of survival. In other cases, even when survival isn't a necessary consideration, connection to a homeland and to cultural understanding can be sought after by diasporic communities. Obi Asika, in a press conference in Portimao just before the inaugural 2019 Afro Nation Festival, said, quote, "When the decision was made to host a festival in Portimao, part of the decision making was when I realized there's a Lagos here in Europe. So close, I was like, it's written in the stars that we need to do it here," end quote. Although Asika and Smaid, the founders of the festival, have spent most of their lives in Britain, they often look back to and pursue connections to their Nigerian heritages. 4 years later, when Asika Smaid and Josh Coram, the head of artist booking for Afro Nation Detroit, built an iteration of Afro Nation Festival for Detroit, Michigan, similar negotiations of African and African diasporic lineages were engaged to imagine an unexpected, though historically significant, hub for global Black community making. Leading up to the 2023 and 2024 Afro Nation festivals, the organizers emphasized the history of Detroit as a refuge for Black Americans, the local and global significance of Motown, and how these Detroit histories and musical legacies could embolden Black transnational encounters. In this paper, I contextualize the significance of Afro Nation Detroit, explore representations of Afrobeats and the African diaspora in the US Midwest, and interrogate the centers and peripheries spaces for Black diasporic engagement. Specifically, I examined the online reception of Detroit as a location for Afro Nation in 2023 and 2024. Though some residents of the Midwest and those familiar with Detroit's musical past celebrated the decision to host the international festival in the city, others were confused and critical of the decision. I compare the reception of the city, the experiences of festival goers, the musical histories of Detroit as a globally important destination and distributor of Black popular music, and experiences of members of the African diaspora that inhabit the US Midwest. I argue that Afro Nation Detroit is involved in re-emphasizing and reintroducing the US Midwest as a center for global Black music and diasporic engagement. I was planning to attend the festival last year, but I was in Lagos and couldn't figure out a way to fly to the US to attend. So here is a vlog so you can get a picture of the experience.
Hey y'all, what's up y'all? It's your girl. Oh my goodness, we back over here with the Uprising Network. We about to go on the Afro Nation Day 2, and we about to get this thing kicked off. Yeah! Where are y'all from? From Kenya. Yes. All the way here. No. Okay. That's good. I love the culture. It's like Kenya to Miami, like it's yeah. Hey, that's good. Hey, she knows she said it so good.
Takayuki Tsuda depicts diasporicity, or the range in which a group of people can behave more or less diasporically, as, quote, a wheel with the homeland at the center and the various overseas diasporic communities on the circumference, with the spokes representing their ties to the homeland and the wheel rim representing their connections to each other, end quote. Though more useful than the solar system model towards understanding diaspora, as this understanding imagines an absolute center for diasporic peoples, the diaspora wheel still does not account for the ways that populations, events, or a collective consciousness can reinscribe value to other spaces of cultural or national belonging. While complicating the narrative of a Jewish homeland with an ethnographic study of Jewish Moroccan residents, Andre Levy writes, the cultivation of a unique past is recruited for the needs of the present. Hence, although there is a constant preoccupation with the past, it is aimed at a present needs. Therefore, diaspora, like nationalism, is not committed to a real history. Its survival depends upon its ability to found and enhance identification with traditional values that serve entrenched needs in the present. In Levy's study, the process of finding and enhancing identification with traditional values that serve entrenched needs in the present is signified through Moroccan Jewish communities establishing a strong connection to Morocco and, as a result of complicated, intense socio-political relationships, migrating out of the country in a similar manner as that of Jewish migration out of Israel. Levy argues that due to these series of events, immigration has turned Morocco into a symbolic center that competes with Israel. Although not always connected to migratory patterns, communities connected to African homeland also shift and complicate origin stories based on geographic associations. Through the lens of transnationality, my own family history is documented alongside that of other African-born immigrants that ended up in Kentucky. Transnationality may be a useful framework to bring into analyses of diaspora, specifically when zooming into particular homelands from Africa, for example, or a country rather than continent, and particular destinations in the US, like states rather than country. The authors of Voices of African Immigrants in Kentucky anchor conversations of connections to or between African origins and new US homes and theories of transnationality as a way of emphasizing that regardless of how long immigrants may reside in another location or country, migrants never really completely move out of their places of origin. In conversation with my mother and father, they found that Robert and Tembu are definitely part of the Lexington, Kentucky community. However, Robert still says, I'm from Malawi. His geographic definition of home is his village. One of his brothers once urged him to come back to Malawi where he could become an important man, the CEO of some organization. He could have done that, but he made other choices based in part on educational opportunities for his sons. Perhaps Robert is like his maternal grandfather in embracing change, what some would call modernity, the future. He is, after all, a computer science professor teaching the next generation of Americans. Still, the past and one's roots continue to have a place in the United States where one has grown. In this case, when considering belonging and origins, or the ways that migration and diaspora connections can shape and reshape communities, local identification and local heritages blend into broader discourses about nationality and culture. African popular music generates similar conversations when one traces the histories, sonic influences, artists represented, or prominent stages among the industry and community. Interrogating these elements of African and African diasporic musics shapes narratives and imaginations about who and what links the traditions together. Deontay Harris, for example, foregrounds Michelle Wright's theorization of a post-war epistemology in Black studies, or the assertion that there are multiple African diasporas rather than a single African diaspora, to propose the existence of a Caribbean diaspora. Further, while Harris acknowledges the Trinidad Carnival as the center of Caribbean-style carnivals, he emphasizes Notting Hill Carnival as yet another center, particularly for the Black diaspora in Britain. In a similar manner, we can begin to assess Afro Nation as the largest contemporary event for African and African diasporic popular music, and Detroit as arguably one of the most important cities for Black popular music, from this slightly different view of diaspora studies. The history, legacy, and distribution of Motown as a specific categorization of soul music as an industry and as a cultural export is perhaps the most notable local and global musical export of Detroit. Berry Gordy spared little time from the moment Motown Records' official launch to ensure that the label had an international presence. Attracting the Beatles into Motown fandom certainly helped as the group began praising Motown artists and indicating interest in collaborations during their rise to international stardom. However, support from other UK music industry insiders like Dave Godin launching the Tamla Motown Appreciation Society became part of Detroit's musicians and music scenes, reaching audiences beyond local or national borders. Furthermore, techno as a music tradition firmly rooted in the narrative of Detroit's musical legacy offers another example of the global potential that this region's musical influence carries. Lastly, with the likes of Eminem, Big Sean, Jay Dilla, and Lizzo, among others, linked to Detroit's hip-hop and R&B histories, the wide reach of the city's music reinforces an understanding that Detroit has had a significant role in building and reinforcing networks of fans, artists, and industries of Black music. Racial tensions resulting in white flight and disinvestment from urban centers through the 1980s and beyond left Black communities, particularly in places like Detroit, in difficult financial circumstances. And unfortunately, when industries are given the opportunity to exploit citizens and bleed communities dry, the once thriving centers of finance and culture are left struggling. More so when institutions privilege racially motivated investment and disinvestment. Victims of such activity, namely people of color, are left with little resources to rebuild communities with. Subsequently, narratives that speak to the prosperity of a region are shifted and sometimes encourage more condescending or critical pronouncements. When public memory is eroded by time and the significant achievements of a city are held by fewer and fewer champions, as decades tediously move into a new millennium, the once obvious U.S. location for the largest festival for Black music in the 21st century is more frequently interrogated. Speaking with senior producer of One Detroit, journalist and filmmaker Ozzy Uduma spoke about her short documentary film highlighting Nigerian migration to Detroit and the ways that Uduma and other children of Nigerian immigrants oscillated between spaces of Nigerian culture and lived experiences as Black Americans. Specifically emphasizing the significance of a Nigerian diaspora in the US Midwest, Uduma said, quote, "Now what I've learned as of recent is that a lot of people don't know that there are a lot of Africans in the Midwest, particularly in Detroit. I don't want folks to fear the fact that there are, folks who are immigrants, folks who are maybe not a part of the traditional American story who are here in this country." End quote. In Uduma's documentary, Detroit We Day, her parents and other members of the Old Bende Cultural Association of Michigan recount the story of arriving in Detroit in the mid to late 1970s. This was at the height of Detroit's wealth being moved to suburban areas when white residents migrated out of the urban center, and many of the companies providing jobs followed suit. Though Uduma is focused on the migration and community formation of a small group of Igbo people, this movement does represent a larger influx of Nigerians to the United States following the Biafran War and refugee and immigration initiatives established around this time in the United States. In addition to producing new relationships with African American communities, this migration helped foster transnational connections between African traditions and American traditions. For example, Duma reflects on hearing Afrobeats at the Old Bende community gatherings in the regional home of Motown, techno, and many treasured jazz artists. The Afro Nation Festival first launched in 2019 with Portimao, Portugal as its initial location. Over time, versions of the festival would also reach Ghana, Puerto Rico, Miami, and obviously Detroit. There was a notable attempt to bring the festival to Lagos in 2023, arguably a location that should be one of, if not the center of Afro Nation's enterprise. The Lagos Afro Nation Festival was canceled, however, about 2 months before it was scheduled to take place. The noted reason being that it is currently not possible to deliver a show that is of the quality that Nigeria deserves in December 2023. Despite the difficulties in preparing a Lagos Afro Nation Festival and the still limited occasions for bringing the African diaspora to Africa via the festival, replicating the atmosphere and aesthetics of the continent became part of the vision for Afro Nation. As mentioned in the quote earlier from Obiasika, the founders imagined Portimao as a secondary Lagos. With the goal of celebrating these links to Nigeria and while determined to reference the overlapping points of various African cultures, Afro Nation Festival becomes a center for engaging with diasporic geographies, spirituality, and solidarities that are mediated through the vision or experiences of Asika and Smaid. This wasn't working earlier, so we're just gonna go ahead and skip it. The festival began as an idea from Adesegun Adeosun Jr., who is typically called Smaid, working together with his business partner Obiasika and co-founder of Afro Nation. The two began finding personnel to make the festival a reality. Motivated by Pan-African ideologies and diasporic connections, Smaid wanted to create, quote, the first festival to celebrate the African diaspora, end quote. I held some skepticism as to whether this can truly be considered the first long-term, large-scale musical event specifically focused on bringing together the traditions of the African diaspora. Lagos' own Festac, World Black and African Festival of the Arts in 1977, and the previous 1966 World Festival of Black Arts in Dakar are but two contenders. However, the first Afro Nation is remembered as a joyful celebration of a multitude of Black traditions and various nationalities, all united by their immediate or distant connections to the African continent. Freeman Powell put it more plainly, writing, quote, sound systems shook the ground at beach parties, pool parties, and boat parties, where you could find Jamaicans doing the shaku shaku and Nigerians datu whining. Again, Afro Nation was met with criticism and skepticisms by members of the broader global diaspora. When promoting the 2024 festival, Smaid alluded to the criticisms and ultimately success of the 2023 festival. I'm not going to read this interview interaction. This is from a local Detroit news broadcast. Miami, a city with a population about 10 times larger and in the 21st century global consciousness with clearer connections to popular festivals, transnational engagement, and international tourism, was cited by Smaid and many others interested in the festival as a more obvious destination for a festival like Afro Nation. Yet the histories of Detroit's music and Black population in this instance proved to be a greater factor in determining a festival location. Surely the financial possibilities were important. As with any organization guided by neoliberal and capitalist incentives, money talks. However, as Smaid noted with discussing the financial impact of local Detroit businesses, Afro Nation was still able to sell tickets to over 10,000 participants coming from 140 different countries. Furthermore, Smaid argues that providing a lucrative financial opportunity for local Black and African businesses is part of the goal of Afro Nation. He suggests that, quote, this is what Afro Nation does. It impacts cultures, it merges cultures, bringing people that have never been to Detroit before to see the beauty, end quote. To be clear, Afro Nation did also host a festival in Miami in May of 2023. Burna Boy, Nisi, Major League, DJ Z, and DB and Go-Go were some of the performers that were in the US during 2023 for both the Miami and Detroit festivals. The point, however, is not in whether or not Miami or any other US city is more or less deserving of the festival. The tensions that emerged from Detroit receiving the burden and excitement of hosting an international festival were based in the perception that a Midwest city that has, to some, become known as destitute and unexciting, became the chosen location. Perhaps a city as such as Chicago may have been met with more understanding. However, the overlooked significance and forgotten Black and diasporic populations of the city within the reception of Afro Nation's announcement for a Detroit festival are not without consequence. On some level, the 2023 and 2024 festivals became more than just a celebration of African and diasporic musics, but a reminder of the global impact that Detroit's music scenes have had in the 20th and 21st centuries. Despite claiming that they hoped to host an Afro Nation festival for as long as the city will welcome them, there are no plans for a festival to return in 2025. The reasons for this are not clear, nor have they been expressed by the organization or the city. However, the Afro Future Festival, previously called Afrochella, will take its place at the same location where Afro Nation hosted their festival, the Bedrocks Douglas site. Once again, Detroit will be hosting a festival for African popular music in its debut to the United States. The festival began around 2016 in Accra, Ghana. Afrofuture has done similar work as Afro Nation, bringing artists from the Black diaspora to one location to create a musical space of global Black solidarities. However, unlike Afro Nation, which started in Europe, Afrofuture has primarily stayed in and brought festival goers to Africa. Forgive me because I must take advantage of the poeticism required to bring a festival called Afrofuture to Detroit. In this moment in time, when African popular music is demanding to be reckoned with inside the global popular music landscape, there is little that can contend with witnessing missions of the divine and secular converging upon the Midwestern African diaspora. Perhaps this framing is a bit dramatic, but admittedly, I tend to speak dramatically. It is not only a part of diaspora, but a fundamental experience within humanity to demand acknowledgement. To internally, or for those bolder than myself, externally, exclaim the nuances of your existence, those traits that make you worthy of respect or admiration. Whether one seeks these things from an immediate community or a broader public, there is a yearning for one's history to be placed confidently in the halls that memorialize moments across our intersecting existences. As Hanif Abdurraqib poignantly writes, while expressing a certain exhaustion and fear that comes from being Black in America, there are days when the places we're from turn into every other place in America. Yet, as he has also written so beautifully and specifically, Abdurraqib's relationship to Columbus, Ohio, and the unique relationship that the city holds with him and the broader Black public is worth recognizing. Similarly, members of the Black Midwest, and in my case, a Kentuckian, which I also argue is either Midwestern adjacent or spiritually Midwestern, demand our histories and our identities to be legitimized amongst the global Black consciousness, especially in critical moments for Black and African popular musics, and within what I believe is a critical moment for African popular musics, the Midwest demands a place within the global popular music industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much for another very fascinating paper. Do we have any questions for Quilla? Yes.
Hi, thank you for your paper. You've given me a lot of food for thought. I just had a question, just thinking about these different festivals in Detroit. I was in Detroit like the late 80s or early 90s, and there was the African World Festival too. And I was just kind of interested in how these festivals compare in the audiences they're attracting and the messages. African World may be not a complete music festival, but it was really an important event back in the 90s. I don't know what it is like now, but have you thought about that in doing your work on this particular festival?
Thank you for that. A little bit. Yeah, the African World Festival was actually another one mentioned in the documentary Detroit Weekday. And could be another, the Smade's comment about Afro Nation Festival being the first like Black diasporic festival. That's another one that's like, but yeah, as far as the populations that it attracts, because I imagine, like, I don't know too much about that one, but I imagine that one to be more of like celebrating the sort of indigenous, historic traditions. So it's maybe a bit less of like the popular music traditions, but maybe like celebrating like the instruments of like the talking drum and the those like traditional instruments, which I would imagine would attract sort of these younger populations that are like very focused on or engaged like very specifically in like the African popular musics, but I would imagine it like maybe has a bit of a wider reach to other generations of African diasporic peoples. Whereas the like Afro Nation festivals tend to be, from what I've seen, for those like the sort of younger coming of age, like within like the 21st century and those sorts of crowds. Because similarly, when I was in Lagos, there's always kind of a bit of admonishing or something of I mean, even coming from Malawi, different generations to myself, of forgetting maybe those traditional aspects. And when I was in Lagos, there were some, but it seems like the younger generations are still like very interested in those, and it maybe tends to be, like you said, not maybe just focus on music, but a sort of broader cultural understanding. But yeah, this is definitely something to think more about, putting those festivals in conversation. So thank you.
Okay, I have another one. I was taken with your thought about, one African diaspora versus many. I'm headed to Cambridge the week after next for the British Forum for Ethnomusicology, and we're going to do a roundtable with a scholar in London. And we've had some interesting discussions, coming out of with the notion of defining Black in popular music from a diasporic lens, and how American popular music kind of dominates that narrative. And I'm hearing from you that people are looking for ways in to be included. And I was just hoping you could say a little more about the many African, if they're multiple versus one, and how that plays out, or how you see that changing the narrative, or how we engage with that, particularly in music.
Yeah, thank you for that question as well. That's something I've been really interested in. For I think Deontay Harris, he did a Zoom talk at Cincinnati. I think maybe it was my first year of my PhD, and I remember him talking about Michelle Wright and the post-war epistemology, and it was one of those things that I think a lot of us, that we hear something and it just like completely changes our worldview, because it is like something that has that's been a little sticky with me, this idea that we can only look at Black identity and Black consciousness through this transatlantic theoretical analysis, which is very important and very useful, but there are so many other events that have sort of happened since then, and have like caused migrations and just different sort of cultural different sorts of like musics that have been established that hip hop has been the particular one for me, where as a hip hop scholar, I've been studying it for a while, and whenever it some iteration of it pops up on the continent, there's this idea that, oh, it's coming back home, and it's like, yeah, but also it's like this very specific thing from African American, from like an African American consciousness and understanding. So yeah, but I've also kind of played around with the idea of like there being like a hip hop diaspora or something, and that gets a little bit murky for me. Like I think that needs a little bit more parsing out, because diaspora is people argue that it can sort of fit in sort of any sort of dispersed population, but also like the sort of referencing back to an original kind of homeland, that makes it difficult. But yeah, I do think like the multiple diasporas, like I very much agree with like Deontay Harris and other folks who work with like Caribbean diaspora as that being sort of like another emergence of sort of cultural space and identity that people connect back to that's separate from just connecting back to the continent. And similarly, like I think you could probably, I've mainly worked in like US popular musics and African popular musics, but I imagine you could look at other regions and maybe make some compelling arguments for other spaces as well. Like I think there are some scholars, particularly in our recent moment, that are thinking of not necessarily the transatlantic slave trade, but sort of on the other coast. So that sort of connection to like Asian communities, I think also builds a whole other identity piece and cultural connection as the slave trade from sort of the other side of the continent emerges and creates a different kind of dispersal. So yeah, anyway, so yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your great paper. You have started talking about this, and I was thinking about throughout your paper, like Essence Fest, it happens in Louisiana, and thinking about like who are the performers that are coming to these festivals, and there, you'll see like a lot of women, and you talking about how hip hop has been dominant. But I'm wondering with sort of like the rise of Afrobeats, if you also see that prevalent, like if you've seen that here or in like other festivals you've been thinking about, and how sort of this melange of like Black diaspora musics that are like coming together at these different festivals, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I probably have.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
We are at time, and I know people might need to leave, so I encourage the conversation to continue afterwards and also over lunch. But if you want to give like a 1 minute answer for everyone, because I'm interested to hear too.
Okay. Yeah. So I do find that really interesting, and sort of the way Afrobeats, and I think now people are saying Amapiano, like South Africa, is really bleeding into all of these other musical traditions, hip hop being one specifically. But it gets a little sticky. I did like a paper about sort of the imperial consequences of like U.S. music industry. So I think there is still a piece of that exists when there's like that relationship, and especially when industries and money are involved as well. There's like power and hierarchy issues. But just from sort of like a cultural standpoint, like I do find that interesting how this like diaspora in these festivals, like performers coming together and collaborations even in recorded music coming together to sort of like create this, create these like the sharing of traditions.
All right, thank you so much. One more round of applause for our panel.